Latinx Research Center, an interdisciplinary and Trans-America's research hub focused on the lives, experiences, challenges, and contributions of the diverse community of communities that is the Latinx population of the United States. I'm Laura Perez, chair of the Latinx Research Center, coordinator of the Chicano Studies program, and professor in the Department of Ethnic Studies. I'm pleased to welcome and thank the experts in Latino politics who join us in today's roundtable on Latinos and the 2020 election. California Senator Maria Elena Durazo, Supervisor Luis Alejo, Mike Madrid, Councilman Kevin de León, and the moderator and principal organizer of this event, Dr. Ignacio Ornelas Rodriguez. I would now like to introduce you to Dr. Ornelas Rodriguez, and he in turn will introduce each of our speakers and the structure of today's roundtable and Q&A. Dr. Ornelas Rodriguez is a historian who conducts research on civil rights, social justice movements, and electoral politics. He works in the Department of Special Collections and the University Archives at Stanford University. In 2018-19 and 2019-20, Dr. Ornelas Rodriguez served as a visiting scholar at the Latinx Research Center. Again, a warm welcome to all of you joining us today. And now I present Dr. Ornelas Rodriguez.
Thank you, Laura. Welcome to the Latinx Research Center at UC Berkeley. We are just a few days away from the 2020 presidential election. And during today's webinar, we will be discussing the history of Latino electoral politics, this year's election, Latino voter turnout, and predictions. We will be taking audience questions at 1:15, so please submit your questions through the chat room. We are witnessing record voter turnout this year. According to recent data, and I've actually changed this a few times already, but it looks like 40 million Americans have already voted nationally, and over 1 million in California have cast ballots. Nate Silver from 538.com is predicting high turnout. This has been a very difficult year for the Latino population across the US. Many Latinos are struggling through the pandemic. The workforce has been dealing with environmental catastrophes, but they continue working through it all. This 2020 presidential election will have paramount implications for the Latino community. Overall, the community is struggling with access to healthcare, affordable housing. We are privileged to have four incredible guests today. Senator Durazo has successfully organized Latinos through the labor movement for decades and has been a loyal advocate for Latinos. The senator was recently voted by her peers to lead as chair of the California Latino Legislative Caucus. Councilman Kevin de León became the first Latino to serve as president of the California Senate in over 100 years. He also passed historic legislation to protect immigrants in California, and SB 100, which has made California the leader in the environmental movement to protect all residents, but especially Latinos who are disproportionately affected by pollution. Thomas Friedman of the New York Times called him, quote, an unsung hero of the green movement, end of quote. Supervisor Luis Alejo, as a California Assembly member, passed landmark legislation, including the bill to raise the minimum wage to the highest level in the country, and to allow undocumented immigrants to obtain a valid California driver's license. Mr. Mike Madrid today is one of the most successful and powerful political consultants in the country and running a historic campaign with the Lincoln Project. The success of Latinos and their trajectory in electoral politics has been decades of organizing and advocating for civil rights, labor rights, and social justice causes that dates back to the work of the League of United Latin American Citizens, LULAC, the Community Service Organization, CSO, the GI Forum, the United Farm Workers, the UFW, California Rural Legal Assistance, CRLA, and the Mexican American Legal and Education Fund, among others. Let me begin by asking, well, let me just state this also. Many of us are in the academy today, in electoral office, and successful entrepreneurs because of the political groundwork by these organizations. So I begin by asking Senator Durazo, How have these organizations influenced your career and path to electoral office?
Well, good afternoon to all of you. It's great to be here to have this conversation, and thank you, Laura, Ignacio, Abraham, everybody who helped put this together. It's going to be great to interact with you all. I would say before getting exposed, well, the Farmworkers Movement clearly was the first organization that, although I wasn't as a farm worker in the union, it was all around me. It was part of us going from, harvest to harvest, doing the piscas. So that was the first one. And clearly it raised the issue that even poor Mexicans, farm workers, had the right and had the ability to be something, to push for our recognition, to push for our rights. So that was the first organization that had an influence on me. It also had an influence on me in terms of what a union could be. And that was the first union that I personally really knew of. And it was more of a movement than it was an institution. And that was of a lot of influence on me. And then I went to the Fresno version of the Chicano moratorium, which wasn't not anything like East LA, but it was pretty cool. It was the first march I'd ever been to, and I didn't know it was the first of many hundreds that I would be involved with. But that idea that a movement is what gives people confidence. It gives us that we are somebody, we are in a position to do more for ourselves than somebody else doing it for us. And then, of course, Bert Corona was a big influence on me. My first direct labor organizing campaign, I was at St. Mary's College, and it was Bert and Chole Alatorre who recruited us from St. Mary's to go help these women who were on strike at a tortilla factory. They were all Mexicana immigrant women in a strike. And I was like, wow, this is again, another level of exposure that I think was really important. So the labor movement, the immigrants' rights movement, a movement, I think had everything to do with what I then later on decided to do with the rest of my life. And so many of these I think were indirect, but you hear about them, you meet individuals, and all together they make they had a really big influence on my life. And ultimately, there's a slogan that I believe in the most, and that is, we do the most good for the most people when we empower them to do it for themselves. And try to live by that motto, that I'm not the chingona leader. I'm someone who, side by side with people, teach them to find their courage, and then they will do for themselves. And that's a lot more powerful. And I think that's what the power that we created in California out of Los Angeles.
Thank you, Senator. Mr. Mike Madrid. Same question, a little bit of history and the social movements or political organizations that have influenced your career.
Well, thank you. Again, I'm a little bit different than most of the other panelists. I want to take the opportunity to thank Berkeley and the department, along with the esteemed panelists that are talking with me today. A lot of them are good friends and people that I've worked both alongside with and against throughout the years. I came up through a very different trajectory. My people are from Durango and Sonora. I'm from Southern California. I decided I want to spend my life and career working for the advancement of our people and my people through primarily economic justice and economic concerns. I worked actually with Supervisor Alejo to establish the California Latino Economic Institute to do that. So most of, I think, the folks on the panel today have really beautifully spent a life and career in working towards civil and social justice. I support most, if not all, of those aims. My approach has been very different, though. It's been to accomplish economic justice and economic equality and at trying to specifically address the enormous gap between rich and poor, especially here in California and other southwestern states where the gap is getting only bigger. So my trajectory, my focus has been largely focused on the data, the resources, and the underlying economic concerns that have driven most of our people into, unfortunately, what is appearing as generational poverty, and some of those issues that have become manifest. And recognizing that so many of the other social issues that we have to confront, be they healthcare issues, healthcare access, college access and college graduation rates, the prison pipeline that we have unfortunately built for so many of our people, are so directly correlates to economic issues, and recognized early on that unlike other, especially our African-American brothers and sisters that have groups like the Urban League, we don't have many institutions, or really any institutions, that focus primarily on economic justice and economic issues. So that has been my route. That has been my trajectory. It has been a little bit unique. It has been, frankly, a little bit lonely. But I'm hoping at this point in my career that especially younger people watching today might find that as inspiring, because it's been my very firm belief that once we begin to address and solve for many of the economic justice issues that we face and confront, a lot of the other issues don't go away, but they get a lot easier to solve. I think we have found that with other communities that make up the social fabric of America who have done that successfully. I think we're well positioned as a community to do that. And I'm called as a passion to kind of address that on behalf of my community.
Thank you, Mike. Same question for Councilman De León.
Well, thank you so very much, Nacho. And obviously I went at UC Berkeley. Laura, good to see you. To my good friends, to my successor, Maria Elena Durazo, our senator for the 24th Senatorial District, and my good friend on the other side of the aisle who's done incredible work this past electoral season, Mike Madrid. And of course, my very good friend, up north in Monterey County, Huicho, Luis Alejo, a very good friend. But for me, being the youngest child of a single immigrant mother with a third grade education, the only one to graduate from high school in my family, the first one to graduate from high school, and the only one to graduate from high school. What formed me as a young person was no doubt having a single mother, being raised primarily in an almost entirely female household. My mother being a housekeeper. We were very urban, so we were not rural or Central Valley or Imperial County, for example. Growing up in the barrio of Logan Heights in San Diego y Tijuana, frontera con San Diego y viceversa. So what was very formative for me was my mother as a housekeeper working in La Jolla, California, a very wealthy enclave with the panoramic view of the Pacific Ocean. And my mother would spend the vast majority of her day, if not the vast majority of her life, cleaning other people's homes. So it was there I learned the value of hard work and about my mother's very strong work ethic. And taking the number 34 bus, which would start in San Isidro, adjacent to Tijuana, Chula Vista, National City, and Logan Heights, and would traverse itself through downtown San Diego, Mission Beach, Pacific Beach, to our final destination, La Jolla. That had a huge impact because that was this one woman who was mother and father, this one woman who paid the rent, paid for the clothes on my back, put the food on the table. And, when you're very young, you don't have the at least for me, I can say, I didn't have the sort of analytical skills or the maturity to sort of kind of have a deeper appreciation for someone like my mother, not until I got older and went off to college. But that had a huge influence on me. Or I cut my teeth politically, without doubt. I was very politicized, but for me, what was my political awakening was Proposition 187 and working with an organization that was headquartered right in Boyle Heights on the corner of Esperanza and Whittier Boulevard. And that was a one-stop immigration and educational center. And Maria Elena had talked about Bert Corona and Hermandad Mexicana Nacional. And at that time, it was an incredible experience for me because ignorance is bliss. Teaching English as a second language. I had been kicked out of school, UC Santa Barbara at the time. I had 3 consecutive quarters of very poor grades. But I was very lucky because I was a beneficiary of affirmative action, and I know that's on the ballot for Prop 16 today. But I was teaching ESL as a second language, U.S. history, civics, and we were organizing to our undocumented community who were eligible to become legal permanent residents and eventually not U.S. citizens. And that was an incredible experience for me. I grew tremendously. Interestingly, I never thought about running for political office. It just wasn't in my DNA. It wasn't in my blood. I had no political aspirations. Was never ASB president, senior class president, young college Democratic president. It just wasn't part of our DNA. Another young man at the time, Fabian Nunez, who ascended to become eventually the Speaker of the California State Assembly, in a very similar situation. So that's where we cut our teeth politically in Boyle Heights, organizing, doing rallies, and then organizing what was then the largest march in the history of California, which has since then been eclipsed by larger marches, particularly in the immigrant space. But that's where, I thought perhaps, one thing I'd add is the first time I thought perhaps, I should run for office, or one of us who needs to run for office, was then Assembly member, Democrat, who represented that area, who Maria Elena now represents partially within her senatorial district, Boyle Heights, which you had a Democratic Assembly member named Luis Caldera, Harvard, West Point, eventually became Secretary of the Army under then President Bill Clinton, President of the University of New Mexico. So very high, prestigious posts. Well, at the time, he was the co-author of the measure to take away driver's license from our immigrant community, or undocumented immigrant community, to be very specific. The other co-author was a state senator named Alfred Alquist from the city of San Jose. And that was the very first time that we thought to ourselves, well, maybe one of us should run for office. I don't know who, it doesn't have to be me, it can be somebody else, but one of us should run for office. And one of us did. It was Juan Jose Gutierrez, CD14, the seat I hold today. We lost, but to Nick Pacheco, and Victor Griego was the candidate for labor at that time. And then, may he rest in peace, Miguel Contreras was the head of the LA County Federation of Labor. But that's when I thought, we should run for office to assume positions of political power so we can effectuate real change that would improve the human dynamic for all individuals, but in particular the most vulnerable. You gotta.
And I'll just jump in here. This is a Supervisor Luis Alejo. I'm in transit traveling, but I'm glad to join in, and I'm going to get on video when I just get situated here. But I did want to just add to that, because certainly, and thank UC Berkeley, my alma mater, go Bears, because we're thankful that an institution, unlike much of the press today, has written a lot about Latinos and what impact they're going to have on the upcoming election. But very few have actually had a conversation with us so that we can speak about our thoughts about the importance of this election. What does it mean to our community and trends that are occurring within our community from the West to the East Coast. And certainly to this very question, though, many of us that are in office always stand on the shoulders of giants that came before us, certainly on the shoulders of my grandparents and parents who joined the Farmworkers Movement at a very early age. But just like former Senator de León, many of us as teenagers took to the streets and organized walkouts during Prop 187, and that really being a catalyst for many young Latino leaders to want to dedicate their careers to make social change. But just to end, I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for the trailblazing work of a voting rights lawyer who passed away just a couple years ago, Joaquin Avila, who was the lawyer fighting in our courtrooms, challenging political voting systems all throughout the Southwest, certainly in California, in my hometown in Watsonville, one of the earliest cases in the federal courts under the 1965 Voting Rights Act that really changed local voting systems from at-large to districts. And that led to later judgeships changing to that, and even creating the first Latina to join the LA County Board of Supervisors. So when in this conversation, I think a lot of us in office owe a lot of great work to that trailblazer who really paved the way for many of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Supervisor Alejo. Let me ask Senator Durazo, you know, a lot of history and the impact of Prop 187 and the Wilson era. So where are we today with Latino political power at the federal level and at the state level as far as representation?
Okay, sorry. Well, I think we're obviously in a much better place. Prop 187 was a great moment to galvanize what existed out there. And by the way, before I jump into that, I do want to appreciate what Mike said earlier about economic justice. I agree 100% that everything comes from that, which is why I've worked so closely and devoted my life to the labor movement, because without economic justice, our communities will always be marginalized, ignored. Frankly, when I first got elected to be president of the Hotel Workers Union, I had internal political struggle, because the head of that union was a white immigrant who had banned the use of speaking Spanish in union meetings. And we had to take him on. We had to oust him. It was very contentious, but we did it. And we did it because unless Latinos were in the leadership of the union and really moving and mobilizing within the union, we were never going to move away from a nickel an hour wage increase and those kinds of things. And now, very proudly, years later, starting wage for a housekeeper in a union hotel is $20 an hour, plus full health care, plus a retirement, plus a lot of other rights that they have on the job. So I don't want, they should not have to be standing in line like I was a week ago, standing in the line for several hours to get a package of diapers for their babies. You know, they should be working with the dignity that it takes to then say, I'm providing for my family. And I went through that personally as well as organizationally. But today, all of the movement, all of the men and women who have said, yes, I'll step up to run for office, and many of them have won and some of them have lost. That's added up, people like, Phil and El Soto and Alatorre and Polanco and Scutia, Hilda being the first woman, and then Antonio, Fabian, KDL. There's just a whole slew of all these great leaders who've been elected and who have made a difference. So there are 29 legislators, and Luis, you're pushing hard here. 29 legislators and 5 statewide constitutional officers. That's a huge difference. And Latinos are being elected beyond the districts that are Latino majority, right? And we're everywhere in different parts of the state, northern, central, southern California. But we have a few things to break through. We don't have a Latina in statewide office, and we have to change that. We have to make a difference in that. We knock on wood, Biden and Harris get elected, there'll be an opening as a U.S. Senate. We definitely should have a Latina in that position. We've grown in the number of congressional members, Latinos. We're still very far behind, but we've just got to keep pushing at it. I mean, here's a state with 40% Latinos, 40% Latinos. We should not be the first. This is 2020. Why are we still dealing with the first this, the first that? That should have changed. But to me, there's a real, we have to maintain that connection between being elected, between being policymakers, our academicians, everyone else, and a movement on the ground. I truly believe that when we don't have a connection with the movement on the ground, and we think that we could be the saviors of all the ills in the world, then we make a huge mistake. We lose enthusiasm. We lose the energy of people on the ground saying sí or no. They'll turn on us because they have a right to turn on us. If we don't do enough, if we promise and we don't do what we promise to do, being at their side, then we lose them. Don't ever think that we could go off on our own and solve all the problems. So I have a lot of respect for those who thought about building a bench, you know, for the future, who fought for our voting rights, who fought for fair elections. Look at this. We're all worried that maybe in these last few days, there may be thugs standing out there, you know, at these voting centers trying to intimidate people. The threat's been put out there, you know, publicly. So we've got still, it's like all our battles are not behind us, you know, all our battles continue and they're ahead of us. And we've got to learn from the way we've won, and we have to learn from the ways we've lost, and, you know, keep it all going. And I'm really hopeful that we can not only elect more Latinos, but they're Latinos who really fight for our community.
Thank you, Mike. Let me get to the 2020 election. We're running a little behind on time, but the question for Mike Madrid, who wrote a very compelling essay in the Atlantic this week, and I'm quoting Mike, you wrote, "What Democrats don't understand about Latino voters," for 30 years, political consultants have been predicting that in the next presidential election, a growing Latino electorate in the United States will finally awaken, sway the outcome, and usher in a new era of Latino political power. And for 30 years, they have been wrong. Mike Madrid, why have consultants been wrong about Latino electoral politics or turnout, right? And will they be wrong again this year?
Can't hear.
Sorry, they muted me, which happens a lot to me, by the way. Look, the question here should not be viewed as a partisan one. If you read the piece, I've spent my career advocating for my community. I don't care if it's for Republicans or Democrats. I'm not ideological. I'm an advocate for my community. And so I will fight for it wherever it is and where it's at. And I would hope that there is an additional understanding that I don't see, certainly not in the Republican Party, which attacks our community, but even with the Democratic Party, which is clearly has, Joe Biden's got some issues with the community. That's just undeniable. I've talked with Bernie Sanders' Latino organizers on a daily basis, and with Mi Familia Vota and Unidos US and other folks that I've been on different sides of the aisle with, and sometimes we work on the same side. It's of no consequence to me. I just want the work to get done. But the piece really references the changing nature of our community. As I mentioned in the introduction, our community is going to surpass the African-American community this election cycle in the sheer size of our vote. It's a very, very important inflection point in the history of our community. What we are also seeing, though, at the same time, is we're seeing this movement towards a different type of politics on both sides. You're seeing, again, I think it's a very momentous occasion when my good friend Chuck Rocha with the Bernie Sanders campaign got an extraordinary historic turnout of Latino voters on a message that was frankly as much against the Democratic Party as it was against the capitalistic system. Something we need to listen to. It's not an ideological argument. It's a political sense in our community that things are not working. At the same time, you've got Cubans in South Florida that are voting for Donald Trump in historic numbers, and US-born Hispanic Mexicanos in Texas that are showing numbers at 37% for Donald Trump. This is not good, okay? This is quantifiably very concerning, and it's something we need to be listening, because it's not an indictment on any partisan, it's an indictment on a system that is not responsive to our community. And as long as we're not, we should not be surprised that both sides are moving further and further away from a political structure that is finding us at a great moment where we can actually be determinative in policy decisions. So from where I come from, and the reason I wrote the article was not at all to make any sort of a partisan judgment. I could care less. My whole career has been not worrying about those things. Where I'm coming from is saying the entire political system needs to be far more responsive to our community. And both sides, well, one side doesn't care. The Republicans just don't care. They're running against us, right? The Democratic Party has, I think, a lot to learn. And I say that, again, not to be critical, but to be instructive. And to say if we don't engage people, then we're going to continue to see what we saw from 1998 up until 2016, which was a dramatic decline in the civic engagement and the voter participation in our community. So we do have this sleeping giant, but the sleeping giant wakes up and it goes back to sleep for 20 years at a time. And it only wakes up when the community is under threat and under attack. That's a problem. It's a problem that is not being addressed by our political system. And it's one that I think is relatively easily resolved if we just had the focus on the right area where our community is telling us what it wants and what it wants addressed. And I just don't see that happening right now in the current political structure.
Let me ask Supervisor Alejo, you were very involved politically in the primary. Has the energy of the Latino vote that we witnessed during the primary and the Sanders campaign, other campaigns, has that transferred over to the Biden campaign?
Well, I think there's going to be a lot to be seen. I think there is a lot of excitement among Latino voters. In fact, throughout the country, 1/3 of the voters have already weighed in and cast their ballots. And as Mike had just said, we have a record number of Latinos, the largest group among people of color who will be voting this election cycle. But I want to always preface that Latinos are not homogeneous. We are diverse ethnically, geographically, by generation, by religion, by a lot of different points of view. I get frustrated when I read a lot of the write-ups that are being done about the Latino community that somehow, because 30% of the community is voting for perhaps Republican, for Trump, that's somehow a worrisome sign. I do think that the Democratic Party should do a lot more, should do focus their efforts on a lot of GOTV, especially in these last few days. But the fact that a portion of our population votes for Trump or the Republican Party is nothing new. If we look what happened in California just in 1994 during a very contentious, draconian, anti-immigrant ballot proposition, Prop 187 that was mentioned earlier, 33% of Latinos, we voted for that back then, over 25 years ago. But you see what's happening in other states like Florida, Texas, Arizona. The vast majority, including California, vast majority of Latino voters, about 2/3, are going towards Biden. But I do get upset when I hear those stereotypical, derogatory explanations that somehow must be a macho thing between Latino men and supporting Trump. It's never been that way. Every Latino family has had an uncle or a few family members that have voted contrary to the rest of the family. So I just wanted to point that's nothing new. But I am excited to see the trends, what's been happening in some of the key states. And I think Latinos are going to be a key deciding factor in this race. And they will continue to be as our population grows in some of these key swing states as well.
Councilman De León, you just ran a very successful campaign at the city council level in Los Angeles. You've been very successful throughout your career in getting the vote out in general, but with regards to the Latino vote, what do you see as far as this campaign season with the Latino vote? Is it coming out? Are we seeing the numbers?
I think that the numbers are going to come out without question. I think the numbers are going to come out the last 2 weeks. Latinos tend to be lower propensity voters. Tend to be historically mired more so at the lowest economic strata. So folks, wait a little longer and they vote on the latter stage as opposed to high propensity folks. But let me underscore something that Luis said, because I think Luis is spot on with regards to we're not a monolithic, homogeneous community. There's different, racial, there's different geographical factors, socioeconomics, different histories. When you have a large percentage of the white community who votes in majority numbers for Donald Trump, or for example, white women who voted in 2016 election in majority numbers for Donald Trump, there was no recriminations from within the community itself as to why did they do this, So, the bottom line is, ideally, subjectively, I'd love for all Latinos to vote on a Democratic ticket, without question. We know that's not going to happen because it's not a homogeneous monolithic community. Given the fact that, Donald Trump's record with regards to caging children, at the border, separating and ripping children, babies out of the arms of the mothers and fathers, ICE raids in our communities throughout, racial profiling and racial targeting of our community, the fact that he has overtly, nonchalantly insulted us as rapists, as thugs, as murderers, as people who don't have a very strong work ethic, que somos flojos. That in itself, clearly, demonstrates, at least on the West Coast, I can't speak for Florida, Florida, there's going to be a lot of Latinos voting for Joe Biden as well, too. The socioeconomic histories are very different with regards to Cuba and the history of Cuba and the diaspora of Cubans and Cuban refugees coming into the United States, in particular to Florida and the key straits. But I think that last night's presidential debate, which obviously was a lot more calmer in comparison to the last one, you heard Joe Biden say very clearly, openly, and publicly, and very coherently, that if you give him an opportunity to be the chief executive, the commander-in-chief of the United States of America, and that in the first 100 days, he will send to the Congress an immigration reform package that will legalize a sizable, undocumented community that we have in the United States, 10 million plus already in the United States, the vast majority being on the West Coast, being here in the golden state of California. But he made it very clear, where Donald Trump, in contrast, said, you know what? He didn't talk about immigration reform. He talked about, what could have happened in the past, but didn't happen in the past. We're talking about the present and the future. And one thing too is my good friend Mike. Mike, makes really salient points with regards to demographers, political scientists, sociologists, with regards to geographic patterns, and the sleeping giant has awakened, has gone back to sleep, and so forth. There's truth to all these components. And Maria Elena agreed with regards to economic power. Economic security is political power, because those who have the financial wherewithal and have access to capital make a tremendous amount of decisions that impact the human condition on a variety of issues across the board. So having access to capital, who gets capital, who doesn't get capital? What's your FICO score? How bad is your FICO score? Are you paying for a flat screen television set that costs $800? Are you paying $2,000 because of interest, because your credit rating? So having access to capital, what your FICO score is, economic financial empowerment is without a doubt absolutely critical. And I think we're moving on to different stages. It's going to be absolutely critical for elected officials across the board, not just Latinos, but all elected officials, to move an agenda that's a proactive agenda, that's an empowering agenda. And also it's about how we exercise power, because we can have a lot of Latinos in elected office, whether in the state capitol, in the Congress, in city councils, mayors, county board supervisors. But if we're not exercising political power, we're just there. We're just there sort of kind of present, in the moment, holding space, but we're not exercising the power and pushing even within our own establishment ourselves. What needs to be pushed, those policies that ultimately what Maria Elena is championing, what Luis is championing, and others, policies that truly improve the quality of life. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, all we want is real opportunities for children, for our families to succeed. That's all. And that means do not judge us based on the color of our skin, based on our legal status, the language we speak. Judge us based on our merits and who we are as human beings. So ultimately, that's what we're talking about. When we're talking about political power, we're talking about opportunities to succeed, first and foremost.
Thank you. Senator Durazo, you are a veteran of running campaigns dating back to your time in the labor movement. And labor has historically been very active and responsible for getting the vote out. How do you see labor this year, or other social justice organizations? Is the Latino vote coming out in record numbers?
Okay, here we go. Well, we haven't, and I don't think in California we've seen the record numbers in, up until this moment. We're seeing the movement start to happen of Latinos voting, but it's not like a big onslaught. And there are some very practical things. We were all thrown off by the pandemic. Latinos do best when we have real face-to-face, when we have real personal contact. That hasn't happened the way that it usually does. All of a sudden, we had to go from being able to do it the traditional way to, send the ballot by mail or do the drop box. I mean, all those sorts of things really threw off, I think, what should have been already an overwhelming participation in voting. I don't want to give excuses for it. I just think it's a reality of what happened. We do best when there's the one-to-one contact. And I know in my experience, the way that we were able to elect people like Kevin and Fabian and others was because we had that one-on-one communication. My home union, the Unite Here in Arizona, is doing that. They're not letting the pandemic hold them back from having that face-to-face conversation. Nevada turned blue because of the Culinary Workers Union. That's the core of their work, is the one by one conversation. They're doing it with the protocols. They're doing it in a safe way, but we can't drop that as organizers. We cannot drop that communication and out of the legitimate fears that we have and stop the communication, the face-to-face communication with our community. And I think, unfortunately, that's had some impact. There's no doubt in my mind that the overwhelming majority of Latinos will vote for Biden and Harris. I mean, there's every reason. And of course, there'll be, a quarter or so, whatever the number is, that vote for Trump, but we will have the overwhelming. The question is how many will turn out. And also because we have other things on the ballot, it has become, not just for Latinos, a bit overwhelming to have so many important issues on the ballot. They don't know what Prop 16 is. There's not enough information about Prop 16, Prop 22, Prop 15. So there's so many issues on the ballot that can be something that throws off. But I do want to say, if we don't have, if Democrats don't show that we are very different and that we're willing to throw down in the way that our community throws down, that's part of, not having the enthusiasm and the energy to go to the polls. Mm-hmm. And they could still be supportive of Biden and Harris, but why did it take, how many years, Luis, for the driver's license? I mean, 10 years or whatever.
20.
What's that?
Took 20.
Yeah, I mean, for farm workers to get overtime, we can't get Medi-Cal expansion to low-income seniors in our state. So there are some real significant issues that as Democrats, we can't take for granted and expect the same level of energy and enthusiasm is going to be there. We all are fighting for very hard to get all these things done, but we have to push harder within the Democratic Party to make sure that more gets done for the right reasons. Yeah. The economy. Tell me how much of the economy, the fifth largest economy, brag about it. A significant part of that success is the Latino community, Latino workers. You name industry after industry after industry relies entirely on Latino workers. So I think we do in some circles, talk about that, but it's not a terrible thing for a Latino voter to say, well, how much more difference has this made in my life? Let me judge that. It's not a terrible position to take if they think that we haven't delivered as much as we should. And the pandemic has showed how outrageously, has exposed how outrageous our communities lack healthcare, the digital, both technology as well as the knowledge, all these things we've been talking about, bam, it hits us right in the face. And our community is suffering more than anybody, 10 times more than anybody, not just the spread of the cases, but also in deaths. Essential workers, look at this foster farms, 300 to 400 people. And while they were refusing to implement the changes they should have, 9 people died. We should all be completely outraged and demanding something, So I think it's fair for our Latino community to demand more of us.
Mike, let me ask you, you have taken a very strategic campaign against the President of the United States and the Lincoln Project. And during a pandemic, I can't think of a more successful campaign through social media, through commercials. What was it about this change, the strategic move by you and other colleagues to run the Lincoln Project?
Thanks. Look, it's been a really incredible experience this last year to be one of 8 founders to kind of lead the effort to defeat Donald Trump. And your question is actually the perfect one. We recognize that there were the President of the United States had taken advantage of a couple of developments, particularly a keen understanding of the way media works and his ability to control the narrative by using social media. We knew that we would have to overwhelm him using that same tactic and kind of beat him at his own game. The way we did it, I think, was probably because we were not elected officials. Most elected officials, I would say virtually all elected officials, have one quality that Donald Trump does not, is that they've got shame and humility. They're naturally wired to try to engage people and work to solve problems. Donald Trump is the exact opposite. He has no shame. And so he's willing to go down lower than any other politician is normally constituted to do. As political consultants, might not make my mother proud, but we're more than happy to meet him where he's at. And we'll bring the fights to him, and we'll bring it stronger, edgier, and harder hitting on a more regular basis than he has been able to do. That has done 2 things. The first is it's contained his message and isolated it into just the conservative media bubble, and it's forced other networks and other media outlets to not give it the same legitimacy that they have. The guy lies. The guy uses crass, vulgar terminology. That in 2016 became clickbait for all the other media outlets to kind of function on and give it more oxygen than it needed to have. We felt that we needed to meet the enemy where he was at. And I think that we've not only done that, we've done it faster with better quality content on a more regular basis than even he's able to put out. And so in that way, what we did was we really kind of shut down at the narrative level his ability to expand his message and expand his base, even though he probably wasn't inclined to do so anyway. But more importantly, and this is what my job has been with the Lincoln Project, is to focus on the data and the voter targeting. It's really 80% of what we do, but most Americans recognize the Lincoln Project for the videos that we put out. And I don't want to diminish those. They've been extremely effective in terms of heightening the awareness and being the offense that even Biden couldn't do in the middle of the summer when he didn't have the money, the resources, or the ability to leave his home while we're in the middle of a pandemic. We knew we were going to have to be the offense. We knew we were going to have to be the tip of the spear to aggressively go after him. And we've been doing it in a very smart, sophisticated, resourced way with key segments of the Republican electorate in the right states in order to move Biden into the position which we think he is now in, which is a very commanding position and the right place to win this race. So we're happy with what we've done. And I think in many ways we've redefined the modern campaign. A lot of that's, to your point, is because we were in the middle of a pandemic. And a lot of that is only possible when so many people aren't out door to door, out working when they should not be, and are simply, utilizing social media and watching what's happening both on television and on their phones.
Supervisor Alejo, well, a similar question about campaigning the last 10 days of an election, but also, before we get to predictions, I wanted to ask you, what are the demands that Latinos should make if we have a Biden Harris victory? Historically, it's like, here's this position, I don't know, housing and urban development, the other one that usually a Latino gets. What are those demands that Latinos should be making and asking instead of waiting?
First of all, I want to just commend the work by Mike Madrid. I think when we look back at this election, I think if there is a group that had the most effective message and using, in many instances, Trump's own words to educate the American community about what he stands for, has been the Lincoln Project. And I think he's earned a lot of respect, not only from Latino leaders, but from voters of all colors from all across our nation. So I think I commend all the Lincoln Project because it's been hard-hitting, continuous messaging, and it's been very bold and effective, I believe. But I do have to say, I was a national delegate for Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton in 2016. And the fact that Latinos are taken for granted has been something that has gone on for too long by the Republican Party, but I would even say, and be honest, to say our own party could do better. And every election comes around, and then there's a call to how do we reach more Latino voters, but then again, there isn't that effort to focus on voter registration and talk to the issues that really matter to Latinos, and they'll change. Certainly, as Maria Elena just pointed out, Latinos and African Americans are the hardest hit by COVID, infections, hospitalizations, and deaths. And if we're not talking about healthcare, which in every poll for Latinos is polled high, if not the highest, in Texas and Arizona, Florida, and California, the party should be focusing on that, especially in light of this COVID hitting our community the hardest. But also, we know that with the digital divide, our children are being the hardest hit now with not having the right technology to attend their virtual classrooms. 60%, over 60% of the kids in K-12 schools in California are Latino. 76% are students of color. And when we're not addressing that issue, it not only impacts the students' education or the careers of workers that are accessing jobs online during this pandemic, but it's also how voters get their information. If they don't have access at home, if they don't have technology, more campaigns are utilizing social media, the internet to get information to voters. It's more effective. It's cheaper to reach voters. We're also missing voters because of that big divide that exists in California. And certainly the legislature and the governor should be making that a priority next year because it's going to be critical in every election from here forward. And that's being blunt and that's being truthful. The other thing is a large portion of Latino voters are not reached. I think Latino Decisions had a poll that 50% of Latino voters do not get contacted by a party or by national campaigns. And that's why Voto Latino has been pushing national campaigns to be reaching every voter, even the low propensity voters, so that we could encourage them to become regular voters. Last thing about what should Latino voters ask for. In California, as Maria Elena pointed out, there's a big question. If the Biden-Harris campaign were to be successful, there's a big opening for the U.S. Senate seat. There's never been a Latina or Latino to serve that seat. The Governor Newsom has already made high-profile appointments, an African gay justice to the California Supreme Court, the first ever, the first female, the first second African-American as a CHP commissioner in our state. With those high-profile appointments, Latinos, I think, are expecting our governor to appoint a Latino or Latina to fill this vacancy that I'm very confident will happen. But there's been a call since early August from the Latino communities. The Latino Foundation had a coalition of many different organizations asking the governor for the same. But if Latinos are going to matter in these elections, I think our party and our state and national leaders also have to show Latino community that when openings happen, that we're going to provide new opportunities for leadership to continue to rise to all levels of government. And I think this is going to be the most prominent one that all our community will be paying attention to in California.
Councilman De León, you have been very successful in electoral politics. You are not shy of making the big ask. You are not shy of working across the aisle. You have been very, very successful with regards to getting bills passed, with regards to immigration here in the state of California, but also the environmental movement. You're known internationally. What are the kinds of demands that that we should be making, that the Latino population should be making with a Biden-Harris victory?
Well, you know, knock on wood, come November 3rd, we will hear about President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Kamala Harris, a daughter of the state of California, one of our very own, which would be historical, having a woman and woman of color become the next Vice President of the United States. You made a very interesting point. I think historically, for reasons unbeknownst to me, there's always a Latina woman who's the treasurer within the Secretary of Treasury on our dollar bills, whether it's a Republican or Democrat. I have no idea why. You know, it's not a position that holds a tremendous amount of power. Obviously, you know, your name on, you know, U.S. tender is one thing. Being the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury is another thing altogether. Historically, a person of color has always filled the seat of HUD. You know, it is an important issue with regards to housing, especially what's happening today with our unhoused community, what is happening today with those who are on the periphery of being evicted once that eviction moratorium expires come, you know, January 31st of 2021. If we can't handle 150,000 unhoused homeless individuals today in California, the 5th largest economy on planet Earth, how are we going to handle 1 million plus individuals, working families, as Maria Elena just so eloquently and passionately just articulated, who are the salt of the earth, people who are working in their fields, who are the hotel workers who are unemployed right now because of the edict shelter in place, primarily Latinos, Latino women, immigrant women, and single mothers, just like my mother. And so, you know, what is the expectation? Obviously, we should always think the highest imaginable. You know, we should have a Secretary of Energy who's a Latino, dealing with the issues with regards to climate change, renewable energy, nuclear energy, and so forth. You know, why not a Secretary? I'm not sure, you know, Mike, maybe you help me with this with regards to EPA. I don't know if it's cabinet, you know, status right now, or an EPA director, Environmental Protection Agency, given that the vast majority of our communities are frontline communities, breathing into their lungs every single day, dirty, toxic fumes, and drinking, you know, contaminated water. You know, why can't we have, you know, a person of color and a Latino or Latina, one of us, be the secretary or director of the EPA? And, you know, obviously we have commerce, we have Secretary of State, and other, you know, positions. I will say one thing that's quite interesting, and maybe Mike would, well, you know, George W. Bush, you know, obviously I did support George W. Bush, but George W. Bush had a Latino general counsel, not general counsel of civil rights, not general counsel of minority redistricting, reapportionment. He had a Latino general counsel to the White House. He had an African-American black male, you know, Secretary of State. He had a national security advisor, you know, who has obviously ties to Stanford University, Condoleezza Rice. That's what we want to see as well, too, on our side, because we should not have to fight, you know, to have a seat at the table continuously. We shouldn't have to beg continuously to have a seat at the table. You know, we're deserving because of our history. We're deserving because of our contributions, you know, economically, culturally, politically. We're deserving because many of our men and women have given their lives to this country, whether it be World War II, whether it be Vietnam War, the Korean War, Afghanistan, and Iraq. In fact, you know, the first World War, I should say not World War, but the first war, Desert Storm under George W. Bush, the first individual who was killed, the first casualty, was a young man, an undocumented immigrant, by the way, from San Fernando Valley, who was Central American, Guatemalan. Poor soul, may he rest in peace. Actually coming as an undocumented immigrant, no family, making it to Los Angeles, you know, decides to give his life to this country, enlist, you know, in the military, goes, you know, overseas. A Guatemalan goes all the way to another part of the world. He's the first casualty. He's the first person who's killed. But that's erased because for some folks, you know, our presence doesn't matter. Sometimes they love our food. They love visiting Puerto Vallarta, Cancun, but something's missing because they don't love us, you know. And to a point that Mariana made, Latinos influence every sphere imaginable. If you are a vegetarian, it was a Latino who picked La alcachofa in Luis's, backyard, la fresa in Luis's backyard, el apio, la cebolla, la manzana, etc. If you're a pescatarian, it's a Latino. You are a carnivore, it's a Latino. So whether you go to Whole Foods or Sprouts or Gelson's or Safeway up in North Cal, where you go down, to Vons or Ralph's, it's a Latino. If you go to a very high-end hotel or mid-level hotel or lower-end motel, guess what? Those are Latina women who are cleaning up your room, who are making your bed. If you like A1 steak sauce, because there were the Teamsters or the women in Ventura County over in Oxnard who lived primarily in La Colonia or Santa Paula or Fillmore, those were Latina women who make A1 steak sauce. You put in that bottle. They influence every imaginable sphere. And I want to add to one thing, because it gets to me. Hollywood in our own backyard in Los Angeles has a big perpetrator of the lack of our presence, because that has such a major influence. Donald Trump's support in Orange County doesn't have any impact on me. We may watch them on the news channel with their signs, go back home to, wherever you come from, say all and spew all these epithets, these horrible things. They have no impact on me at all whatsoever. I watch and I say, pobrecitos, qué lástima. Están confundidos. Who has had more impact has Hollywood. Whether what we're portraying, the stereotypes, or what's even worse, because it's even more damaging, the fact that we're not represented anywhere. And that has a powerful impact on the culture of America. Whether you live in the Midwest, Iowa, whether you live in the Southwest, the Pacific, Northeast, or the Southeast, that hardwires people's perceptions of who we are as a community. And last time I checked, by far and large, our friends who have contributed greatly to my campaign, in Hollywood, tend to lean left, center of left, So we have a lot of work to do. We've made major advancements, but we have a lot of work to do. We still have a tremendous amount of work to do. So during these very difficult times during coronavirus, as Maria Elena just mentioned, which we have been exposed greatly to the deep structural, systematic inequities that exist, that we've always known exist, but they're more raw. The very fact how shameful that an undocumented immigrant who is put into unemployment insurance cannot draw down on that money, but it's subsidizing naturalized citizens or U.S.-born citizens or legal permanent residents are subsidizing them because they can't draw down on that money because they're a pillar of this economy. So it's no more hiding in the shadows, asking for forgiveness or begging. It's how you exercise and use power and utilize that power to make things come to fruition. That's how SB 100 happened. That's how Sanctuary State happened. That's how, with Luis and myself and others, that's how the driver's license happened. 20 years, 2 decades, with Democratic governors, as well as Democratic-dominated legislative bodies. And it took 2 decades to do that. And by the way, it wasn't the Republicans. It was our very own, in both the Assembly as well as the Senate, Democrats, who took that away, which in many ways was actually more damaging to the Latino community than Prop 187. Because Prop 187's provisions, by far and large, all of them were stricken by a U.S. federal judge.
Yeah.
So the impacts it has are real.
Thank you. Very successful. You're absolutely right. Over the last 2 decades, we are running out of time. A couple more minutes for each question, and before we get to audience questions. But wanted to ask you, what are your predictions? We'll start off with Senator Durazo. What are your predictions for about 10 days from now and this election, as far as getting the vote out and who's going to win?
Well, Harrison Biden will win. I would prefer, and I dream that it'd be an overwhelming, but I predict that it will be decisive enough that there won't be an excuse for, dragging it out or taking it to the courts or anything like that. So I think that's what, I'm certainly hopeful and working hard to be able to do. Can I just, Ignacio, just take 1 minute of this particular time on the previous question that you asked about the administration, when it's a Biden-Harris administration. I too, as Mike, we had presentations made to us by Chuck at, what's his last name? At Bernie's
Rocha.
Rocha. And one of the things that was really impressive, because I always asked, I see these young Chicano kids, and they were like going crazy over Bernie. I said, how is a guy, an old white guy from Vermont with zero experience, zero connection to the Chicano movement, the Latino movement, to our issues? I was like, what the hell's going on? And at least internally, the structure of the Sanders campaign was that they put Latinos in non-traditional Latino positions within their organization. Like they didn't have, okay, director of Latino programs for the Sanders campaign, and that's where they put the, traditionally that's what it is, you put a Latino there. But they had them everywhere, integrated. If you were a comms, you were just a comms person. You weren't a Latino comms person. You were integrated. And that's
just dealing with like Univision and Telemundo. Right?
Exactly. And so to me, it really clicked. That's exactly right. That's what I'm hopeful that any administration, state, a governor, the president, is that we are people. We touch and feel and hurt and cry and laugh just like any other human being. We have some specific, unique experiences that we contribute to that. The way that last night in the debate, the way that the candidates showed their contrast when they were talking about the kids, the migrant kids who were separated from their parents, that's a human issue. So we don't get treated that way, and sometimes we need to act that way, and so therefore our demand should be different than just, okay, we want your Spanish communications, person to be a Latino. So I just wanted to add that from what everybody else is saying, and things like the environment, which KDL has championed in a big way, future of this economy, the infrastructure. There's so many things that we should just be completely integrated and not just, okay, these industries like farm workers, that's it. That's our only destiny. I'm proud, by the way. I am so proud that I worked in the fields next to my parents. I will never make less of them. But alongside them, we need doctors and nurses and engineers and everybody else. So I predict we win.
Mike, again, a very compelling campaign this year. 1 minute, what are your predictions?
I think Senator Durazo said it very well. I think that the fundamentals of this race favor Joe Biden. We have seen a lot of people call it a tightening of the race. I think we're going to see the race get a little bit tighter. I agree with the Biden campaign. It's not this big blowout that we're looking at, but I think the potential for the bottom to fall out for Trump is very real. And I think that the expanded battleground map is really extraordinary. We've never seen 15, 17 states in contention. That's mathematically very problematic for Donald Trump. So that's where I think the race stands.
Supervisor Alejo, what are your predictions? 1 minute.
Well, first of all, I'm excited that there's 32 million Latino voters that are going to be game changers in this election. And guess what? 66% are 33 and younger. So it's a very young voting population that will continue to make strides and be influential in these key states. So on election night, we know the electoral is what really matters, and the battle states that Mike Madrid was just talking about. So I'm going to be looking at what happens in Florida, which right now among Latino voters, it's neck and neck. In Arizona, 25% of the voters are Latino now in that state. And right now, Biden is up, I think, by 62% to 28%. But there was a poll done in Texas where University of Houston and the Univision poll showed that 90% of Latino voters are saying they're going to go out and vote this election. And there's been a record number of registrations by Voto Latino and Beto O'Rourke. But even in that state, Latinos have Biden up by 66 to 25. So those kind of numbers in these key states are going to be those game changers on election night, and as those remainder of the votes are counted. So I'm excited to see what happens in those states, but I think the growing influence of Latino voters is going to be seen on November 3rd.
Councilman De Leon, your predictions?
I agree with everyone, all of the above. I think what's exciting is the expansion of the electoral map, not just the historic battleground states. I think the Latinos who play in those expanded electoral maps will possibly change the future of presidential elections. If we get Arizona to land from red to purple, and who knows what happens in the future, maybe not this cycle, but with Texas. With Texas and Arizona and California, Colorado, that changes the electoral map where, you know, if folks are saying, hey, can we get a Latino to be Secretary of HUD, maybe you're getting more Latinos to say, I'm going to run for the presidency of the United States. And I may have a shot because the electoral map changes and expands greatly. So that's what I'm looking at in the future with regards to what happens with not running for president, but what happens and how Latinos in these historic battleground states start expanding and influencing even more so.
Let's get to some audience questions here for about another 10 minutes. And there's a question for Mike Madrid from Gonzalo Coronado. What is your prediction for the U.S. Senate?
I think the Democrats will pick up 6 seats. I think that what's really fascinating is that the Lincoln Project, we're actually spending in Alaska, Montana, Mississippi, Kansas, Georgia, and South Carolina right now. I just put up a huge amount of money in the last 48 hours. All of those are deep red states. Now, are we going to get all of them? No, but the fact that we're going that offensively tells you what the deterioration in the Republican electorate looks like right now. I feel good that we get a couple of those seats, and I think there's at least a minimum of 6. Maybe Democrats get 6, maybe 7 in this cycle.
Okay, great. Another question from Anonymous. Interested in what the Latino community do to lobby or put more pressure on the governor to appoint a Latino to the U.S. Senate. I asked Senator Durazo.
The best thing we could do is to get out and vote, because there is no more effective pressure on doing the right thing than how do you vote. And if our community comes out in okay numbers, that's one thing. But if we come out in much, much higher, stronger numbers, then that's the most powerful weapon that we have. Of course, along with, all of our leaders and on the ground organizations doing their own communications to the governor's office and anybody we know.
Hey, Ignacio, quickly add, I would say and point out that there's no shortage of highly qualified Latinos and Latinas in California to step up and serve in that seat. For far too long, we've been told to wait our turn, and we're tired of that already. And I think we have a couple highly qualified candidates for that on this very panel, so that's very honoring. But there's a lot more in our state for our governor to choose from, and we hope that he will make the right decision. But I think we need to have more outspoken voices from our community in these upcoming months to make sure that we get that commitment from our governor.
Yeah, a question for Councilman De Leon, who posted a photograph that went viral of 2 young students actually posted also by Supervisor Alejo in the city of Salinas, doing their work in front of a Taco Bell with no access to internet. Both of you wrote a very compelling piece in the Mercury News. What do we need to do to get access to broadband to a larger Latino community, Councilman De Leon?
Well, I want to give credit to Supervisor Luis Alejo because this happened in Luis's backyard, and Luis was really on top of this. And you're right, Luis and I and Assemblymember Eduardo Garcia from Coachella Valley penned together an op-ed piece with regards to broadband digital divide. And I know Luis Alejo right now is working on putting a bond together. But let me just say one thing. Our numbers are growing in terms of political representation. But as Maria Elena says, is the underside the raw, ugly side with regards to the deep structural inequities. The fact that we cannot have undocumented immigrants get money from the CARES Act, HEROES Act. They can't pay their rent. They can't put food on the table. They're in modern day soup kitchen lines today, akin to the Great Depression of 1929. The fact that the vast majority of kids in our public school system, in the aggregate, are children of color, specifically Latinos, that in the cradle of technology with Silicon Valley, they can't even get access to broadband internet, let alone even have a laptop to do their homework, to compete with their own peers academically. So therefore, the inequities get larger and larger and larger and larger. So this is really setting us back right now. So things could arguably said are getting actually worse, not better for Latinos. And that's why when you have political power, you have to exercise it and use it, because ultimately what you're doing is you want to improve the human condition. Because when you improve the human condition for Latinos, it's everyone comes up together. Whether you're white, African American, Asian American, racial mix, we're all coming together. We're not taking from someone to give to somebody else, but we're all doing it in an inclusive manner that appreciates who we are and the rich diversity that we bring together. I have to get off the call right now, but I appreciate all of you. Maria Elena, Mike, Nacho, Huicho, Laura, bien, gracias a todos.
Muchas gracias. Thank you, sir. A question for Mike Madrid with regards to, well, both parties, Democrats and Republicans. I am sitting here today because of the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986 that was passed by Democrats. However, it was signed by a Republican president, Ronald Reagan, which led to a pathway to legal residency and a pathway to U.S. citizenship. Are those days over, Mike? Is there a pathway to some form of immigration reform where Republicans and Democrats can work together?
Yeah, unfortunately, I do think they're over. One of the things about IRCA in 86 people don't remember is it was passed by a majority of Democrats in the House, signed by Ronald Reagan, but the main jockey in the United States Senate was by a California senator by the name of Pete Wilson. Pete carried that legislation and advocated for the Immigration Reform and Control Act. I say that only to tell you how much and how quickly times can change politically. And so your answer, I think, your question is a very good one. I think the answer is those times are past. I don't see the Republican Party coming back and trying to make the evolutionary adjustment that it needs to. The good news is I think that you will see comprehensive immigration reform probably next year if Biden wins, and I think he will, and if the Democrats take the Senate, and I think they will, and if they expand their numbers in the House, which I think they will. We have to remember in 2008, Barack Obama had the choice between healthcare reform and comprehensive immigration reform, and he chose healthcare. This now, I think the mandate is going to be on the Biden administration to move forward the immigration, a comprehensive immigration plan. He will have the Democratic votes to do it, and I think he will also enjoy support amongst the majority of Americans to do it.
Senator Durazo, I know you have to leave us here in a minute also, but I wanted to ask you before you leave us, what can California legislators do to lobby the federal government to get some immigration reform passed?
Well, I do. I mean, obviously, it makes a difference if Democrats are in majority in both the House and the Senate and in the White House. That makes a really big difference as far as pushing it forward and not make the mistake of the Obama administration of waiting. I do think that we need the business community to throw down in a more serious way for that immigration reform. Every year that goes by without immigration reform, it really is going to have a terrible impact on our economy, on jobs, and the growth of the economy. So I think that voice needs to be strengthened, hopefully, on the fair side and a good version of a path to citizenship, and not just guest workers. So I think that's an addition to, as a Latino community, holding our friends Biden and Harris to the commitment that will be a priority. So we can't, treat him as thinking he's our brother and sister and thinking we should give him a break or a pass to put this off is wrong. And I think we all learned a lesson from before, and we got to do it right away.
Okay.
Ignacio, if I could just add, it's been 34 years since that IRCA of 1986, since our nation had comprehensive immigration reform. So it's been completely unacceptable to see such an action for so long. And you would think that components of an immigration reform would have passed with bipartisan support. There was even one bill on the blue card, which resembled the former Ag Jobs bill for farm workers. There should have been bipartisanship to provide legalization for DACA recipients. But unfortunately, none of that took place. And so here we are, and we were glad to get the commitment last night by Vice President Biden that in the first 100 days that he would introduce legislation with the support of members of Congress to put comprehensive immigration reform forward. And so we look forward to seeing that happen in those first 100 days, and to actually see that be one of the first orders of business, is making that commitment to Latinos and many other immigrant communities who have been waiting for so long to have a pathway for themselves or their family members, their loved ones, their neighbors and coworkers.
Last question. Oh, I'm sorry. Or you leave? Okay.
Just leaving. Thank you all. It's
Last
great to be on there.
the audience for, thank you so much, Senator, for Mike Madrid from, we're on the college campuses, for Mike Madrid. What can young people do, those who can't vote just quite yet, but also those who have voted, to get out the vote in these remaining days?
That's a really great question, and it's one we have candidly struggled with extraordinarily during a time of pandemic. Normally what we do is we round our volunteers up, and we go door to door, and we build community, and we engage and mobilize community. There is one distinct advantage, though, that young people have over other people, and that is your capacity to utilize social media to mobilize and engage. And for what I'm going to implore you and beg you as young people to get on and do what we can't do as older folks as well as you can, okay? This works. Social media works. Without it, the Lincoln Project would not have been able to do its work. No matter who we are, how good our content was, if you weren't helping us drive that message forward, it would not work. So most political consultants have never said this before 2020. I think every single one of them now recognizes the value of what it is, and it gives younger people a more leverage in the process than older people, candidly. So it may sound simplistic to you because it's the place that you live in, but it matters. You've got 10, 11 days left. Please engage people, utilize this technology. It is the only way to compete against some of the ground activity. I'm going to weigh in here with the campaign I'm working on, but the Trump people are putting people on the ground in the middle of a pandemic. We're not, because it's not safe, it's not secure. The only way we can compete back is with social media. So please share content, engage your friends that may not be as engaged. It's only for 10, 11 more days. It makes a difference. It has changed the narrative of this presidential campaign, and it's the best way you can fight and be engaged in the next 10, 11 days. Supervisor
Alejo.
I would agree. Certainly the ability to reach your family and friends and your networks, it's so much easier and doesn't cost very much when you're utilizing TikTok and Instagram and Snapchat to encourage your circles and your family members to get out and vote. For a long time, we would always look to that family member, that tia or that mother who would mobilize the family for a family gathering. We also need to tap into those natural leaders within our families to help encourage the entire family to get out to vote, or get all their ballots that are sitting on a table or a desk somewhere, to get them filled out and mailed in ASAP or walked in this particular election. But I would say that I think the legislature in California has done some really exciting steps. And in turn, we have seen excitement among younger voters. The pre-registration, we've saw record numbers, hundreds of thousands of 16 and 17-year-olds who are pre-registering because they want to be already signed up to vote when they turn 18. There's a ballot initiative, Prop 18, that will allow 17-year-olds to vote in the primaries if they're going to turn 18 by the general election. That's 50,000 new voters in California. That's also exciting. I think those messages that we could convey as elected leaders, that their vote matters, and have them create early voting patterns in those early years, they're going to remain lifelong voters. And so that is an early investment that we're making. It's the messaging that we're making, that their vote and participation matters. And I think that's what we need to see replicated in other states as well.
I want to thank all of you. I want to thank our panelists, Senator Maria Elena Durazo, Councilman Kevin De León, Mike Madrid with the Lincoln Project, Supervisor Alejo. Thank you to UC Berkeley. Thank you to Stanford also, and the Latinx Research Center for your continued work, and the LRC Chair, Professor Laura Perez and Abraham Ramirez. Thank you so much for your time, and we will see what happens next. This concludes our talk.
Go Bears.
Don't forget to vote. And go Bears. Definitely go Bears. Adios.